So you say that a newly elected government rarely is ready for the demands and decisions in a post-election period.
Right.
Which I find very surprising. So why is that?
Well, I think the simple short answer to this is simply that they've spent the last many months preparing for an election campaign, and they've put almost all of their efforts into persuading Canadians to vote for them. And they have typically not given a whole lot of thought to moving from an election campaigning mode to a governing mode. And unless the leader of the party, then the new Prime Minister, has had some experience, in fact, in governing, it may take them quite a long time, in fact, to move from the campaigning mode to governing. And the public service can play a huge role in that.
What's the risk to the country if the government isn't ready?
Well, the risk is poor government, and we have a number of examples in recent years when a poor transition leads to struggling in governance, never being able to get it right, and therefore never really being able to take advantage of all the levers of power that a new government has when they're elected.
You outlined 4 stages: pre-election, election, post-election, and consolidation.
Right.
So let's work through each one. In the pre-election phase, what issues does the public service need to consider?
Well, from the public service side, I mean, this is, I guess, marshalling the sorts of ideas that you might want to put forward to a newly elected government or into a re-elected government as to how the portfolio and the mandate of the department that the people are working in might be looked at. So this is really an opportunity for a contemplative 30,000-foot overview of where you're at. On the political side, by the way, what I really meant by that section was for the transition people to, in fact, ensure that the leader of the party is, in fact, knowledgeable enough on all of the major files. And it is interesting, I can remember very vividly in 1993, or for the 1993 election, so doing the work in 1992 for Jean Chrétien was, in fact, for him, bringing him up to speed because he had only recently returned to politics, learning about the new economy and the importance of the IT for Canada and for the world, for that matter. So every leader needs to become much more familiar on emerging issues or long-standing ones.
During the election period?
During the election, of course, campaign for the public service, this is actually when it becomes really interesting. And there, what I'm really suggesting is that the public service spent a whole lot of time paying attention to the election. What are the politicians saying? Particularly, what are the leaders of the opposition parties saying out in the hustings? What are they promising that they're going to do should they become elected? Because should that be the case, the political people will quickly turn to the public service and say, well, we've been campaigning on this for months. What have you got for me? And to say, oh, we haven't been following very closely because we're not political, is not really a very acceptable answer.
Do you have examples of when that has happened badly?
Well, I think one of the best examples I've got is with the Harper government in 2006. Now, this was not that the Public Service of Canada was not listening to Mr. Harper and his team. They didn't quite appreciate the vocabulary and what actually the party was communicating that they were interested in doing. So while they were well versed on the 5 points of the Harper campaign in 2006, they didn't appreciate that this was going to represent a cultural and philosophical shift in thinking. And they, the public service, who had served the Liberal government for 10 years previously, would have to change its orientation and the way in which it thought about public policy issues. And that turned out to be a difficult thing, as I talk about in the book.
Post-election.
Post-election. Well, that's that moment, those rushed moments between the election and the swearing-in ceremony, where the public service is now actually getting the briefing books and the transition materials ready for an in-kind government. So we now know who's won the election. They can throw away all the other materials they prepared for other eventualities and other outcomes. And now they can concentrate explicitly on, in fact, what the new government will need by way of materials. And therein I find, and I comment, that the public service typically over-prepares materials for an incoming government how they really expect a newly elected government or a new minister is going to read 600, 800 pages in 3 or 4 days is just not fully appreciating the difficulty of the jobs of these new ministers. But also at the same time, the public service in this post-election field has got to also understand again the type of people that they're going to be working with. And that represents a serious opportunity for the public service to think about what it represents when a new government gets elected.
Must be very difficult, though, right, for
Well,
public
so many of
service
them,
because of that whole tension between the political and this notion of neutrality.
that's right. I think that's very true. And of course, the public service can always assume that the incoming, especially a newly elected incoming government, will be rather suspicious of the public service, making the typical comment that, oh, I know, they're a this, they're a liberal or a conservative, depending on what government they've been serving, particularly over a long period of time. And there, I think the public service is tested and has to, in fact, emerge from this conversation, the conversation that's inevitably that comes forward, with leaving the political people with the impression that they are neutral, and in terms of political preferences, and would serve and will serve any elected government in Canada. That, by the way, is an important characteristic of the Canadian system. It is what makes us different than many other jurisdictions, and it is an important element in good government. And I think that, in fact, again, one of the purposes of this book is to get this principle out there in the public domain so that it becomes more fully appreciated for future generations of incoming new governments.
And it would seem to me the risk, your fourth phase, the consolidation phase, if you haven't got it right as a public service, and I have worked on those kind of briefing books, and you're right, they're 600 pages, but what is interesting is they are usually a recitation of what we do and what we think and what you, minister, need to know.
Do. Yeah.
And do, even better.
That's right. And no one do, exactly right. But you have to almost turn it around and say, what is it that I have to discuss with my incoming minister, knowing where the new government wants to go and where this particular minister may have already expressed some preferences by way of policy outcomes. And that's often been a difficult thing for many deputy ministers to do, and often for public services in general.
And that becomes the risk in the consolidation phase.
Absolutely,
right.
Absolutely. Now, in the consolidation phase, I see also training for the political staff and training for ministers to ensure that they, in fact, can appreciate what their new role is, because, as I suggested earlier, one of the great challenges, in fact, is to move away from hyper-partisanship and speaking on behalf of the party, and now find themselves in a new role where they actually are going to work in the public interest, the broad public interest, and they're going to work for people who didn't vote for them. And this, sometimes, for many politicians, is very, very difficult to do. And so the consolidation phase offers a new government the opportunity to, again, have this conversation with the cabinet members, political staff, and to reinforce this point. If you don't do it, you could end up, and I think we see this already at the federal level, with a situation where the partisanship still dominates the thinking over the broader public interest.
So the individual public servant caught most in the middle, it seems to me, and has the most critical job is the clerk of the Privy Council.
That's a very difficult job, and many of them will do, and I've interviewed a number of them. This is a very difficult position to be in, for sure. In some instances, the incoming government may have never met this person, possibly has no idea what a clerk does, or a secretary of the cabinet for that matter, and that first meeting between the incoming prime minister and the clerk is critical, and I talked about that in the book in a host of different ways. And they almost always go well, even though we typically know that the clerks don't usually last very long with a new government, but we have, again, a long-standing tradition, convention in Canada, that the incumbent clerk will certainly see a government through the swearing-in ceremony and usually into the consolidation phase before any changes are made. And this is important to me because it recognizes the impartiality of the public service, and again, it has served us pretty well over the years.
It's no secret the public service is going through a transformation, but that perhaps, and I hate to pin it on this government, but for purposes of my question, let me do it, that already there is a view increasingly that the public service these conventions of neutrality are not serving the government of the day well. Do you think we've reached some kind of tipping point on this issue?
This was a huge public debate that took place in Australia about 3 or 4 years ago when the Secretary of the Cabinet and the former head of the Public Service Commission got into a very public debate about serving the public and responsiveness to the government. And there was a definite public debate that took place about where the appropriate place is for that. And I think that's the sort of conversation that's well worth having in Canada as well. But I think the problem with a lot of this, in fact, is that the incoming political people really don't understand the long-standing traditions in Canada and the conventions that dictate an impartial public service. And so they naturally assume one of two things. They assume that the public service is already politicized by having worked for the previous government. And they also assume that they have all the right answers. And they're rather naive and sometimes badly informed about the complexity of public policy making. And so it doesn't bring out the best in either side of the conversation. And so we've seen this movie before, in a way, if you like. And in 1993, again, when John Chrétien was elected, I mean, he went to great lengths to change the nature of the political offices and ministers' offices, to diminish the role of the so-called chief of staff, to become now newly termed executive assistant. And that was to signal to the political people that their job was not to be a counterweight to the public service. It was to do two things. It was to facilitate the input from the public service to the political people, and to provide a political oversight, if you like, to policy issues, but not to act as a gatekeeper, for instance, and not to say no to the work of the public service. And so, 1993, we reversed a trend, lasted 10 years or so, and we've sort of now gone back to a model that Mr. Rooney had introduced, 84 through 93 essentially. And so there's no right answer to this, and there is an evolution for sure about the changing role of the Prime Minister, far more centralized powers, in large part because I think of the internationalization of the Prime Minister's job, etc. But there is still a conversation to take place about what is the legitimate role of the public service in this. If we decide, for instance, that we don't need the public service to provide advice, neutral advice, for instance, then we can go to a different model, an Americanized type model, where in fact we place partisan people in key policy jobs with the expectation that they will in fact be adherents to the ideology of the newly elected government. And you live with the consequences of that type of model.
One of the challenges then must be for, assuming we wanted to keep the existing model, felt it was the right thing, it's for the public service to demonstrate the value it provides in being neutral, because I think you could argue there is a value there as opposed to being partisan.
Well, I think that's right. I mean, presumably you have no interest in the outcome. Now, of course, that's not entirely true, and I think we always have to be very careful to explain the public service has a view. It has its own view. It's a view that's based on its own experiences and its own particular biases in terms of options, and the role of a good deputy minister is to ensure that whatever advice is coming up reflects as much as possible a neutral approach to problem solving. So that's all good. But what I learned, certainly in writing this book, is that is not an idea or principle that's fully appreciated throughout the system. And the more political people you speak to, the more they're skeptical about this idea.
You do say, speaking of policy development, that transitions do not include policy development. Can you explain that?
Well, in the sense that the policy is done by the policy development is typically done by the political people. So the Red Book, produced by Haviva Hosek and Paul Martin in 1993, was a political document. So I would think that an incoming government, or a government that is begging for votes, would have its own policy agenda and wouldn't say, well, I'll let the public service decide what we want to do when we get elected. Now, this has changed dramatically the dynamics around the public service and the political people, because in earlier eras, the Pearson era, for instance, policy originated in the public service. It was not expected that the Prime Minister would have any bright ideas. We now have a different approach. This is, again, it's a very good reflection on how things have changed, where our political leaders, in fact, insist on having an agenda, a manifesto, a platform that says, if elected, these are the 5 things I'm going to do, the 25 things I'm going to do, whatever. And the public service has to be mindful of that, and presumably, in its preparations for the transitions, will in fact work on a game plan that will ensure that these items will be implemented. What we often find, however, is that since the political parties are not particularly strong in Canada and they don't have huge resources, the proposals are sometimes very naive, sometimes unworkable, and even sometimes illegal. And that's the public service's job to sort all that out.
Final question. Provinces, does
Yeah.
the same, we've focused on the federal level,
Yeah.
and I get it, but I would assume the same kind of challenges are
Absolutely.
playing out at the provincial level in this
Absolutely.
country?
I think this story is exactly applicable. And in fact, as I contemplated writing this book, I thought I would do much more provincial than I did, but frankly, I didn't think I could do justice to all of the provinces in any case. During the last election in Ontario, I think the public service did a superb job of preparing for a new government and a returning old government with a new premier. In British Columbia, I was very much aware of some of the transition work done by some of the opposition parties who were anticipating to win the election. They did superb planning. So this is now becoming a well-developed field,